There are a few ways to approach remaking a movie, from taking the same overall structure and doing something new with it, to completely retooling everything from the ground up. Remakes are hit or miss, but they're often at least distinct enough from the original that you can get something out of watching them. Want a nice one and done on the OMEN remake? Dan McDermott was the one who wrote the screenplay, and he was denied a writing credit by the WGA because the script was almost identical to the original movie, so David Seltzer, the writer of the original, was credited as the writer of this movie even though he never touched the remake. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. The First Omen is coming out in a week. Why couldn't they have picked a less confusing name? But before that, we've got one more entry in the franchise to take a look at, and that's the 2006 remake written by Dan McDermott and directed by John Moore. Sorry, written by David Seltzer and directed by John Moore. That's a rough one, Dan, but I mean, the WGA wasn't wrong. While I was going through this franchise, I was getting pretty tired of seeing the story of a child whose family grows ever more suspicious about as strange happenings occur around them until eventually we learn that they're the Antichrist, except we know that from the start because they kept fucking doing it. Because I was growing tired of that formula, I haven't really been looking forward much to covering the remake, since that would obviously be doing the same thing, but if I knew just how beat for beat this remake is, I would have been dreading it even more. This is gonna be a weird video because this remake is such a retread of the first movie that if someone watched it never having seen the original, they'd probably still come away thinking it was at least a pretty damn good story. When I say this is beat for beat, I really mean it. This movie follows the story of the original so closely that there's not really anything I can say about the narrative that I didn't already say in my review for the first movie. This is my least favorite kind of remake because it doesn't just make the whole production seem completely unnecessary since nothing substantial has changed. These kinds of remakes feel really cocky on the part of the filmmakers because it's like they're saying, yeah, you got close, but let me clean this up for you, to the people who made the original. It's a really strange movie to watch, especially if you've seen the first somewhat recently, but I guess it could be interesting to talk about how little tiny changes in the way some things play out can affect the vibe of a story. There are one or two differences from a presentation standpoint between these movies, so let's take a closer look at the 2006 remake of The Omen. The opening scene of the movie is where we get the biggest difference in structure in the remake. A cluster of comets is seen from the Vatican Observatory, which is interpreted as signaling the coming of the Antichrist following a series of other events that were prophesied in the Bible.
Quando il terzo angelo suonò la tromba, una stella fiammeggiante cadde dall'alto, ardendo come una torcia.
Comet changed its shape into a glowing star like the Star of Bethlehem.
I'm having a really hard time figuring out how to approach this movie, but I'm gonna give it my best shot. Robert is played by Liev Schreiber and Catherine's played by Julia Stiles, and both of them do admittedly give distinct portrayals of the characters from what we saw before. They were very old school, prim and proper in the original, whereas here they could honestly be seen as maybe a little more relatable for the average person. Now, whether or not that's a good thing when writing a high-level politician is certainly up for debate, but I'd say the casting overall is probably the thing that the movie does all right with. One of the issues with them following the story of the original so closely, though, is that when the main difference most of the time is the characters and their performances, you end up picking apart every little nuance in the character interactions since it's really all you have to go off of a lot of the time, which can get really distracting. It's like someone made an AI remake of the original using the same script, so you just get these weird little changes that stick out so much more than they would have if this thing set itself apart more. Little things like Damien disappearing from a swing instead of out on a walk, or playing video games instead of messing around on the pool table. It's stuff like this, and it's honestly annoying because it feels like they're going, see, look, it's a different movie, it's a new movie, but it's the most inconsequential things, which sometimes bothers me more than remakes that are bad, but at least do something different. Hey Damien, you getting a build ready for Shadow of the Erd Tree, my dude? I've got my Godskin peeler just waiting outside Moog's boss room, Radon's down, Fire Giant's down, but I didn't burn the Erd Tree just yet in case Melena's got some more to do in the Land of Shadow. see how unengaging this movie is? I don't think it's entirely the movie's fault. I'm slightly obsessed with FromSoft games, but honestly, the entire time this movie was running, I found my mind just kept wandering off into random spots because I felt like I just watched this exact movie less than 2 months ago, and when I wasn't just disengaged because I was getting bored, I got actively annoyed by some of the creative decisions they made, primarily with the handful of absolutely ridiculous jump scares that are way too loud and add nothing to the experience. All they do is cheapen the feeling of watching a movie that already feels pretty damn cheap. There's this odd thing they'll do with what seems to be dreams that Kate has, where she'll see Damien doing some demon shit in this like limbo space, but it feels so out of place and serves no purpose for the story. It's just lazy foreshadowing of things that we don't need foreshadowed because the story does a fine job at showing what Damien is. How do I know this? Because I've seen the original, and this is the same thing. They're just these awkwardly placed, short-lived sequences whose entire purpose is to say Damien's evil before the movies had a chance to show us that through things actually fucking happening. Something that might annoy me even more than that is that this movie doesn't even manage to copy the original well in a lot of cases. I had a section in my video for the first movie where I talked about how Miss Baylock was handled, and I thought her first meeting with Damien would have been something I'd have cut to allow the subtleties of the character to shine more in later scenes. One of those is this one where Kate's asking Miss Baylock to get Damien ready to go to a wedding, but the nanny pushes back against the idea, claiming that Damien is too young to understand the ideas of the church and that they're simply too much for a child of his age. It's a chilling scene that I think would have been a hell of a lot better without flat-out confirmation that she's evil beforehand, but it's still great. The remake just has Miss Baylock say that Damien isn't feeling well, which to me just confirms that this movie is essentially the equivalent of what happens when someone tries to change a few words when copying someone else's work, and it comes out sounding really unnatural.
I was concerned about him last night. He didn't sleep well. I think he might be coming down with something.
They changed Baylock's reasoning purely to try and distance themselves from what she said in the first movie, but in doing so, sucked out all of the impact of that scene because the thing that made it work was that Baylock's defense was about not wanting Damien around Christianity. When you stray so closely to something and you're inevitably forced to change some minute details, you can wind up just destroying certain elements because you're not even thinking narratively while writing the script. The writing process for this movie wasn't coming up with a story and finding a way to portray it effectively. It's literally just scratching out certain lines and changing the wording a bit without any thought as to whether or not the changes work in the context of the story. I was hoping that maybe this movie would handle her character in a more subtle way, which, well, I don't think remaking The Omen is even remotely necessary, would be one of the main changes I'd want to see in a remake for The Omen. But no, she's basically handled exactly the same, but with a performance that doesn't hold nearly the same weight. See, and this is the thing. There are these little differences in the movie, but aside from one that I'll talk about in a second, they're all to the detriment of the movie and feel really, like, pessimistic and uninspired. I don't know if I'm gonna get some heat for this one, but there's one change in this remake that I actually prefer to the original movie, and that's Kate's death. In the first movie, Kathy was shoved out of a hospital window by Miss Baylock, but in the remake, the nanny instead sits at her bedside and creates a large air bubble in her IV tube, and this is the one scene where I actually thought the remake made a good creative decision. This movie is so utterly lacking in any significant deviation from the original, so this scene being altered to a much more intimate, panicked, and disturbing scene wasn't just a welcome moment, it actually got under my skin a bit. There's something really personal and raw about how this scene plays out, and it works. I also found it more believable than the original, and in all honesty, I found I was more invested in the tragedy of what was happening in this one scene because Kate feels like more of a relatable character than Kathy did. At least to me. This is the one solitary moment in this movie where I was even somewhat invested in what was going on, but don't worry, right after that, we're back to our regularly scheduled rehash. I think it says a lot that I spent a long time talking about how I prefer one short scene in the remake. There is so little to talk about with this movie, having recently covered the original. Some moments honestly start to feel like a blatant fuck you, just shifting things around a little bit and trying to pass it off as something new. Remember how Keith died in the first movie? Well, now it happens from a different angle. Cool. The only saving grace of this section of the movie is that Michael Gambon is playing Bugenhagen, and Michael Gambon makes everything better always. I don't want to make a video just talking about the little meaningless, minute differences in this copy-paste bullshit, So let's talk about the music a little bit. One of the defining qualities of the original movie and its following 2 sequels was the incredible soundtrack written by Jerry Goldsmith. It was absolutely fantastic and evoked the religious weight of the story playing out so beautifully, and this movie copies basically everything about the original, so you'd think that the music would be the same, right? Here we have a much less distinct and far more generic horror score that occasionally borrows motifs from Goldsmith's music, which is honestly infuriating, but also very indicative of the effort that went into this remake. It's a shame, and another thing that feels really empty compared to the original movie is Damien. Not that he was a deeply developed character in the original, but there was a sweetness to him that made the ensuing horror very conflicting, especially towards the end where you start to feel that horrible draw between what you know Robert has to do and the instincts we all have to protect children at all costs. That warmth, whether genuine or not, added depth to the movie and gave this great emotional pull, and I think that's largely missing in the remake. Damien feels a lot more cold and distant here, and a lot of the tragedy in the portrayal of the character before is lost, effectively removing that huge tension that made the third act so insanely impactful. I especially think that cheapening Damien by showing these really over-the-top demon versions of him in Kate's dreams is another thing that helps in just sucking any sympathy out of the character, which is such an important element of this story. I'm not really sure what else to say about this remake, honestly. It truly does not deviate from the narrative of the original, so the differences between them come down to these little things like the stupid jump scares that get thrown in and weird unnecessary story changes that feel like they're only there out of necessity to try and pass this off as something new. Like how Robert isn't initially appointed ambassador to Great Britain, but the guy who he works for was, and that dude dies in an accident early on in the movie, which feels like such a dumb and lazy way to try and get a death in as early as possible. It feels like this movie thinks I'm stupid, so it shoves in random shit like this and those weird dream sequences as a way to try and hold people's attention, but none of it works. Here's the thing though, when you basically carbon copy a really great story, then from some weird perspective, you still have a good story. It doesn't feel like that's the right way to word it though, because this should never count. But at the end of the day, someone could watch this movie having never seen the original and have a good time with it because it's basically straight up recreating a really good movie. In a vacuum, it's fine. It's a cheaper portrayal of the first movie because it's not nearly as atmospheric, the score is a lot more generic, and the added jump scares are really bad, but it's still a strong narrative overall. It's just that the strong narrative isn't something this movie came up with. It closes off exactly the same way too, so I'm not even gonna bother with ending talk. It's an odd movie. If Omen 4 didn't exist, this would be my least favorite in the franchise so far, but I'll take a beat-for-beat remake over that shit show any day. I actually quite like the performances, and the change in Kate's death worked for me, and there were a few other moments, like the addition of stained glass and Father Brennan's death, that I actually liked aesthetically. This is just a really cool image. But those are really all I can throw its way, because every other thing that I like about the story of The Omen was in the original movie and done better. It's not an unwatchable remake, but it feels really pointless, and especially if you've seen the original recently, there's just no reason to watch this one. I like the snowy burial site though, this has a great vibe to it. So yeah, that's the remake of The Omen, and with that, we've now covered all the necessary ground before heading into the First Omen. Please come up with a better title, which is going to be out in a week, and I'm hoping I'll be able to catch a showing and have a video up the day it's out. I work most evenings, so fingers crossed there's a showtime on Thursday night after I get off work. We'll see. I'm looking forward to it because the trailer I saw was really fantastic, and I adore the poster so much that I made an entire video gushing about the marketing for that movie. We'll see how the actual thing plays out in a week, and then I'll be following that up with a ranking video for the entire franchise, which will conclude my coverage for The Omen. Until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.